Jim Lee recently did an interview where he said he wished comics were more like manga. For those that don't know, Jim Lee is the president, the publisher, and the chief creative officer of DC. So hearing him talk about comics in this way is quite the headline. And indeed, it is mostly just that. A headline. We're going to be talking about the article and exactly what he said. I'll go into the exact verbatim quotes because it's not quite, comics should be manga, as some people are making their headlines, as probably I will have made my headline today. Shame on me, except I'm here to give you information, so not really shame on me. And this is actually a video I've honestly been wanting to make for the last few years. So thank you, Jim Lee, for bringing this up. But first, let's talk about what Jim Lee had to say. It is a Japanese article, so I am using Google Translate on it. So just a heads up there. I'll put a link to the article in the video description in the comments for those that want to check it out themselves. And if you happen to speak Japanese, you can let me know in the comments if the Google Translate messed anything up here. The stories told in Japanese manga and anime are incredibly powerful. I often find myself wondering what is missing in Western comics and why aren't they able to achieve the same flavor? And he goes on to say, the manga market is bigger than our industry. So the question becomes, what can we learn from this? And from there goes on to say, I don't have the exact answer either, because if we did, we would already be getting the same sales and readership. And he laughs. So he does basically compare the two in this interview, which is a great interview, by the way. They talk about a few things. They talk about the movies. They talk about James Gunn. So I would definitely recommend giving it a read. So as he talks about the comparison between the two, in the article, he goes into it and he kind of talks about why he thinks there is this difference between the two and why manga has more of a mass appeal. Jim Lee says, another thing to add is that in the West, comics and animation have been considered children's media. As people grow up, they move on to live action. And that is true, right? And I think that's a lot of the times why the MCU was able to capture such a mass appeal and capture the hearts and the minds of so many adult audiences in addition to young audiences, because it's superheroes, but it's in live action. Jim Lee also talks about this idea of what comics are as well, and the idea that when we talk about comics, primarily what we're talking about in terms of the mainstream is superheroes. Definitely in Jim Lee's case, as someone that is, working for DC, it's superheroes. That's primarily what they're doing over there. And same with Marvel. And we often refer to Marvel and DC as the big two. And that means that they are the big two publishers in the comic book industry. And what do both of them do mainly? Mainly, they do superheroes. Now, granted, over the years, because Marvel is now with Disney, we also have Star Wars comics, and there's even like Disney comics. So there are other things that those companies do, but primarily superheroes. But when it comes to manga, there's a lot more diversity. I mean, you have superhero mangas like My Hero Academia, sure, but you also have mangas that are none of these things. You have slice of life mangas. You have mangas that are about sports. You have mangas that are about aliens. You could have a manga that's about a manga. In fact, we do have a manga that's about manga. That exists too. You can write a manga about anything. That means that when it comes to reach, the ceiling's your limit. You could reach anyone with this type of book, because this type of book can be anything, whereas comics typically are seen as being more superhero focused, especially if we're talking about the big two. And I know indie comics exist. Hello, indie comics, I love you. And they have a lot more variety, but I'm just saying mainstream wise, when we talk about it, that's usually what people think. Jim Lee says, also, I think manga has an advantage over American comics, which are mostly about superheroes, and that's where the majority of sales and readers are concentrated. In Japan, it's closer to literature, and anyone can read it, and it's not just hero stories. There's a much wider range of genres, like stories about cooking and soccer. You can draw stories from that. He also talks about this idea of how manga can be cyclical in terms of the booms that we see. And he remembers when it first came over to North America in the 80s, and there was a boom in the 90s. And right now he thinks we're going through another boom. And part of that is because younger people actually want to find something that is unique, that speaks to them. And so that's where Asian culture is kind of coming in and capturing a lot of people's hearts and minds. Jim Lee says, but speaking of this moment, I think Asian culture and pop culture as a whole is booming. This is true for K-pop, Korean dramas, and Japanese anime. Young people want to discover something that is uniquely their own. And so it's about this idea of trying to find something that's different than what you're being provided, which, as someone that read manga when I was younger as well, tracks for me. I liked having things that felt unique. And when it comes to comics, in general, speaking of younger generations, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, it's also that mentality of who is this for? And the Western idea and perception in general on things like comics and animation, cartoons, is that these are for people for a certain part of their lives, and eventually you're kind of expected to outgrow those things and move on to something else. Whereas in Eastern culture, in Japan, for example, manga and anime are a part of the culture. They are a part of life. And so it's not that once you reach a certain age, it's more niche for you to be invested in these things. Everybody watches anime. Everybody reads manga. Manga is considered to be more of just literature. So they take it as it is, as opposed to judging it in that way. And Jim Lee says, not only is there a wide range of genres, but adults also read manga and watch anime. As a culture, it's an art that isn't limited to a specific age group. I think this is one of the reasons why Japanese manga and anime are so popular. And I have to agree, I think that's a big part of the reach that manga and anime can get, because in Japan, everyone is into it. And in North America, it is also super accessible for any age group. So when we're talking about my points with this, something that I've seen a lot of people discuss when it comes to this comparison, and something that Jim Lee also talks about in this article, is this idea of manga, outperforming comics. And it's something that Jim Lee kind of alludes to, but I think when he's talking about it, he'd be talking about it in a way that I would, which is that I think on a global scale, manga has more reach, but I think in terms of a Western culture, we still have comics here that are dominating a lot of the market. And manga is still doing amazingly well. I have looked into stats for this. Over the last few years, I've been looking at stats for this. And even now, I have to tell you, I don't know how anyone can definitively say how things are doing, because these stats are not so black and white to look at. The problem with a lot of book stats is that books tend to be put in one bubble. And within that bubble, there is a subcategory, which a lot of people refer to as comics and graphic novels. The problem is that comics and graphic novels, I think, also often includes manga. Because, controversial opinion, manga is a book that has art that is sequential. And comics are books that have art that are sequential. Do you see what I'm saying here? They're not that different, really. So a lot of the times they kind of get wrapped up into the same group for statistics, which is why it's hard to discern how many of these sales are manga versus how many of these sales are floppies, comics, individual issues, versus how many of these sales are graphic novels, and are graphic novels ever also considered to be manga, or are graphic novels purely a trade paperback, which would be a collection for a comic. And also there's hardcovers. I don't know where those factor in. So it's just a lot. And then add on top of that we have digital sales. So it's really hard to read into these statistics. The other side of it is, even when I do get some statistics where I'm like, okay, this is a number and I could give you a number, there are different sites and different resources that disagree on that number. So it's more of a ballpark figure. So while I could say to you that in 2025, between 16 and 19 billion was the sales number for comics and graphic novels, it would also be hard for me to tell you how much of that is surefire manga sales. And the other issue that I have with this is a lot of the times when people are comparing manga and comic sales to one another, they're comparing global numbers as opposed to North American numbers, which is important when we get into the cultural implications, which I'm going to talk about in a second, because I want to talk about the differences in culture for sure and how that affects how and what we read. The other thing is, when it comes to these statistics for North America that I found out that it was just over 2 billion in sales that we did in, I think, 2025 for comics and graphic novels in the US. specifically. And then when it came to manga sales, the same site said about 1 billion, just over 1 billion. So when you look at it that way, if we're assuming that this is a split between comics and manga, it's about half and half. So they're both making up about half the sales. They're both doing quite well. Now, when people talk about comics taking this nosedive over time, well, there have been periods where comics has dipped in sales. Based on all the statistics that I've seen, and I've looked at a lot of them, I've only ever noticed comics going upwards. So over time, comics has only ever grown. And definitely with the success of live action adaptations, it really grew over time. And the pandemic also boosted a lot of book sales in general because people were at home. So they were reading more, which is great. We should all read more. Of course, the same is also true of manga sales. They've also only been growing over time. So what did I learn? Both of these things are growing over time. And as someone that likes both of these things, well, I think that's great. But when it comes to the global numbers, if we wanted to compare them, which I'm struggling to find a breakdown at this time of manga and comics in a global statistic. So keep that in mind. But there are some differences that I think you would want to examine, even if manga globally is doing better, which I would not be surprised by. And here's why I wouldn't be surprised by that. I think it's because culturally there is a divide, like Jim Lee talks about in this article, between Eastern and Western and what we value, what we put time into, and the way that we see comics or manga. I think in Japan, there are more people that read manga in general consistently. It's just a part of the culture. Whereas in North America, we don't all read comics. So there is a cultural divide there that is going to relate to how many copies of something can be sold when we're talking about global comparisons between the two. And even probably when we're talking about manga sales in North America versus manga sales in Japan, even though the US is about 3 times the population size, I believe, of Japan. And it's not even just about the amount of people that read. It's also about the societal pressures that you might feel if you're into something like comics in North America. And while I think this has been getting better over time, as someone that has been a nerdy, geeky person my entire life, I do think that there still are some hangups on people that read comics. And I think that there is societal pressure to kind of grow up and let go of superheroes and not like cartoons anymore and just give all that up. Trust me, I work on the internet. I see a lot of people that seem to be very upset that I like to dress up in costumes and think I should give that up because I'm too old for that. I think people should just do what makes them happy. But there are those pressures that we feel in Western culture. The other thing is when it comes to actually getting into these books, which one is more accessible, manga or comics? And I think manga also wins there because even though I am a very firm believer that you can read any comic on the shelf, any number, pick it up, and because it's serial, you can jump in. And I've said that, and I will say that again and again. Just jump in anywhere. I think more people feel daunted to jump into a comic than they do to jump into a manga series because mangas are self-contained stories in their own universe. And sure, you can have spin-offs. Obviously, with My Hero, we have Vigilantes, but I also have never read My Hero, and yet I jumped into the Vigilantes anime just kind of knowing an idea of what the world is. So even that, even spin-off stuff is very accessible. When it comes to comics, there's 80 years of history, 80 plus years of history for some continuities and universes and some characters. So even if you're jumping into an issue number 1, you know that's not really issue number 1. That's issue number 1 of that series. And that's the other issue. When it comes to manga, when we talk about definitive numbering, so One Piece chapter 1 being One Piece chapter 1 and that's just how it is. Whereas in comics, every few years, sometimes multiple times in 1 year, we decide it's a good idea to reboot a series. It's hard to keep track of, especially when you think of how far back you need to backtrack. Even with some collections, we struggle to organize them properly with comics. It's hard for the people that are even making the books. Ultimately, if you're asking me which I think is better or which I think is more successful, I am a fan of both. So I will also say that Personally, I think these two things are quite similar, and I love that both of them are doing so well. I think manga has more of a global reach, but I think comics still hold a near and dear place in a lot of people's hearts and are only growing and expanding, especially as live action films continue to go on, and as long as those continue to be profitable, which we had a dip, but now we seem to be back up, much like we had a dip in the 90s and Marvel sold off Spider-Man and X-Men rights. But now we seem to be back up. So that's pretty much all I have for this one. I just wanted to share my thoughts on the issue and also talk a little bit about Jim Lee's thoughts because I found them to be quite interesting and hopefully eye-opening for folks like you. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one. And let me know down in the comments which you feel that you connect more with. Commas? I combine comics and manga. That's how I am. These things are unified in my brain. And let me know down in the comments which you find to be more appealing to you, comics or manga. Let me know. I'll see you down there, and until next time, friends, as always, stay nerdy. Bye! And if you like when I talk about comics, manga, you should click this. This is one of those things. Maybe it's both. I think this is the only video that I'll have that'll be both, so probably not.